Now, there are differences between these two kinds of desires. We do not, for example, recognize corresponding states of deprivation for the artificial desires, as we do for the natural desires. There is no word like ozlessness, parallel to sleeplessness. But more importantly, the natural desires come from within, from our nature, while the artificial desires come from without, from society or advertising or fiction. And the reason for this is that natural desires, as a result of this, the natural desires are found in all of us, but the artificial desires vary from one person to another. Now, the existence of artificial desires does not prove that the desired objects exist. Some do, some don't. Sports cars do, Oz does not. But the existence of natural desires does, in every discoverable case, mean that the objects desired exist. No one has ever found a single case of an innate desire for a non-existent object. Second premise, we have such a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy. If you deny that premise and you say, I am perfectly happy playing with mud pies or sports cars or money, sex, and power, I can only ask, are you really? The argument can't compel, it can only appeal. And I think we can refer such a person who denies this innate desire for something more to the nearly universal testimony of human literature. Even the atheist Jean-Paul Sartre admitted, quote, there comes a time when one asks, even of Shakespeare, even of Beethoven, is that all there is? The conclusion of the argument is, again, a thin slice of God. Not by any means all that the Bible tells us about God. What it proves is an unknown X, but an unknown whose direction, so to speak, is known. This X is more beauty, more desirability, more joy, more awesomeness. This X is to great beauty as, for example, great beauty is to small beauty, or to a mixture of beauty and ugliness, and the same of other perfections. But this more is infinitely more. We are not satisfied with the finite and the partial. Are you satisfied with knowing 500 things? Don't you want to know 501? How about 5 million things? You're never satisfied. Truth, goodness, and beauty are infinite. So the analogy that X is to great beauty as great beauty is to small beauty is not proportionate. 20 is to 10 as 10 is to 5, but infinity is not to 20 as 20 is to 10. So the argument points down an infinite corridor in a definite direction. The conclusion is not a God as you already conceive him or define him, but rather some moving and mysterious X, which is more God than your God, which pulls us to itself and pulls all our images and concepts out of themselves. In other words, the only concept of God in this argument is the concept of that which transcends concepts, something which no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the human heart conceived, which is exactly how the New Testament describes God. C.S. Lewis, who uses this argument in a number of places, summarizes it nicely this way. Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for these desires exists. A baby feels hunger, well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire, well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Last argument, Pascal's wager. This is for skeptics. This is for people who think there are no arguments for the existence of God. Suppose someone terribly precious to you lay dying, and the doctor offered to try a new miracle drug that he could not guarantee, but that seemed to have a 50-50 chance of saving your beloved friend's life. Would it be reasonable to try it, even if it cost a bit of money? And suppose it were free. Wouldn't it be utterly unreasonable not to try it? Or suppose you hear reports that your house is on fire and your children are inside. You don't know whether these reports are true or false. What is the reasonable thing to do? To ignore them? Or to take the time to run home or at least phone home just in case the reports are true? Or suppose a winning sweepstakes ticket is worth $1 million and there are only 2 tickets left, and you know that one of them is the winning ticket while the other is worth nothing. and you're allowed to buy only one of those two tickets at random. Would it be a good investment to spend $1 on the good chance of winning $1 million? No reasonable person can be or ever is in doubt in such cases. But, Pascal argues, deciding whether to believe in God is a case like these. It is therefore the height of folly not to bet on God, even if you have no proof and no guarantee that your bet will win. Imagine you're playing a game for 2 prizes. You wager blue chips to win blue prizes and red chips to win red prizes. The blue chips are your mind, your reason, and the blue prize is the truth about God's existence. The red chips are your will, your desires, and the red prize is happiness in heaven. Everyone wants both prizes, truth and happiness. Now suppose, as the skeptic says, there is no way of calculating how to play the blue chips. Suppose your reason cannot prove the existence of God, cannot win you the truth. But you can still calculate how to play the red chips. Believe in God, Pascal says, not because your reason can prove with certainty that God exists, but because your will seeks happiness and God is your only chance of attaining what you want. Pascal writes, either God is or he is not. But to which view shall we be inclined? Reason cannot decide this question. Infinite chaos separates us. At the far end of an infinite distance, death, a coin is being spun that will come down heads or tails, God or no God. How then will you wager? The most powerful part of his argument, I think, comes next. It is not his refutation of atheism as a foolish wager, that's going to come later, but his refutation of agnosticism as existentially impossible. Agnosticism means not knowing, maintaining a skeptical, uncommitted attitude. That seems to be the most reasonable option. The agnostic says, the right thing is not to wager at all. Pascal's reply, but you must wager. There is no choice, for you are already embarked. We are like ships that need to get home, sailing past a port that has signs on it proclaiming that that port is our true home and our true happiness. The ships are our lives, and the signs on the port say, God. The agnostic says he will neither put in at that port and believe, nor turn away from it and disbelieve, but he will stay anchored a reasonable distance away until the weather clears and he can see better whether this is the true port or a fake, for there are a lot of fakes around. Why is this attitude unreasonable? It's not unreasonable, it's impossible. Because we're moving. The ship of life is moving along the waters of time, and there comes a point of no return, when our fuel runs out, when it is too late. Pascal's wager works above all because of the fact of death. Suppose Romeo proposes to Juliet, and Juliet says, give me some time to make up my mind. Suppose Romeo keeps coming back day after day, and Juliet keeps saying the same thing day after day, tomorrow. In the words of a small, female, red-haired American philosopher, tomorrow is always a day away. And there comes a time when there are no more tomorrows. Then, tomorrow, and maybe, becomes no. Romeo will die. Corpses do not marry. Christianity is God's marriage proposal to your soul, saying maybe, and perhaps, and tomorrow cannot continue indefinitely because your life does not continue indefinitely. The weather will never clear enough for the agnostic navigator to be sure whether the port is true home or false just by looking at it through binoculars from a distance. He has to take a chance on this port or some other, or else he will never get home. Once it is decided that he must wager, once it is decided that there are only 2 options, theism and atheism, not 3, theism, atheism, and agnosticism, the rest of the argument is simple. Atheism is a terrible bet. It gives you no chance of winning the red prize. Pascal states the argument this way. He writes, you have 2 things to lose, the true and the good. 2 things to stake, your reason and your will, your knowledge and your happiness. Your nature has 2 things to shun, error and wretchedness. Since you must necessarily choose, your reason is no more affronted by choosing one rather than the other. That is one point cleared up. Now what about your happiness? Let us weigh up the gain and the loss involved in calling heads that God exists. Let us assess the two cases. If you win everything. If you lose nothing. Do not hesitate then. Wager that he exists. If God does not exist, it doesn't matter how you wager, for there's nothing to win after death and nothing to lose after death. But if God does exist, your only chance of winning eternal happiness is to believe, and your only chance of losing it is to refuse to believe. As Pascal says, I should be much more afraid of being mistaken and then finding out that Christianity is true than of being mistaken in believing it to be true. If you believe too much, you neither win nor lose eternal happiness. But if you believe too little, you risk losing everything. But is it worth the price? What must be given up to wager that God exists? What is this $1 that I need to spend to buy the sweepstakes ticket? Whatever it is, it's only finite. And it is most reasonable to wager something finite on the chance of winning an infinite prize. Perhaps you must give up autonomy or illicit pleasures, but you will gain infinite happiness in eternity. And Pascal says, I tell you, you will gain even in this life. Purpose, peace, hope, joy, the things that put smiles on the lips of martyrs. To the high-minded objector who refuses to believe for the low motive of saving the eternal skin of his own soul, we may reply that the wager works quite as well if we change the motive to a high motive. Let us say it does not depend upon the fear of damnation, but on justice. We want to give God his just due if there is a God. Well, if there is a God, justice demands total faith, hope, love, obedience, and worship. If there is a God and we refuse to give him these things, we sin maximally against truth and justice. But the only chance of doing infinite justice is if God exists and we believe. While the only chance of doing infinite injustice is if God exists and we do not believe. If God does not exist, there is no one there to do infinite justice or injustice to. So the motive of doing justice moves the wager just as well as the motive of seeking happiness. Pascal used the more selfish motive because we have that going for us all the time, while only some of us are motivated by justice and only some of the time and rather weakly. Because the whole argument moves on the practical level rather than the theoretical level, it is fitting that Pascal finally imagines the listener offering the practical objection that he just cannot bring himself to believe. Pascal then answers the objection with stunningly practical psychology, with the suggestion that the prospective convert act into his belief if he cannot yet act out of it. He writes, if you are unable to believe, it is because of your passions, since reason impels you to believe, and yet you cannot do so. Concentrate then not on convincing yourself by multiplying proofs of God's existence, but by diminishing your passions. You want to find faith and you do not know the road? You want to be cured of unbelief and you ask for the remedy? Well then, learn from those who were once bound like yourself and who now wager all they have. They behaved as if they did believe. This is the same advice that Dostoevsky's guru, Father Zosima, gives to the woman of little faith in the Brothers Karamazov. The behavior Pascal mentions is religious behavior, taking holy water, having masses said, and so on. The behavior Father Zosima counsels to the same end is moral behavior, active and indefatigable love of your neighbor. In both cases, living the faith can be a way of getting the faith. Pascal says that will make you believe quite naturally and will make you more docile, that is, more teachable. But you say, that is what I am afraid of. He replies, why? What do you have to lose? An atheist once visited the great rabbi and philosopher Martin Buber and demanded that Buber prove the existence of God to him. Buber refused. The atheist got up to leave in anger. As he left, Buber called after him, but can you be sure there is no God? That atheist wrote 40 years later, I am still an atheist, but Buber's question has haunted me every day of my life. The wager has that haunting power. I've spoken too long. It is time for you to write out some questions so that we can have the interesting part of the discussion now. I think people will pass out little cards for you to write questions on, and the brilliant questions will automatically turn to red and fire, and I'll see them.
Okay, this first question is just by way of summary. What were the names of the 5 arguments for the existence of God you gave tonight, and are there any other strong arguments?
The first cause argument, the argument from design, the argument from conscience, the argument from desire, and Pascal's wager. Yes, there are other strong arguments. My own favorite is the aesthetic argument. I know 3 ex-atheists that were converted by this argument. There is the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, therefore there is a God. You either see that or you don't. There is also, for example, the so-called common consent argument. 99% of all human beings who have ever walked this planet have believed in some sort of God or gods. If they are wrong, and if atheism is right, then 99% of all human beings have been seriously and literally insane. At least as insane as I would be, as an adult, if I believed in an invisible childhood friend or a 13-foot-high invisible rabbit whom I made the center of my life and said, I love you, I worship you, you are my creator, I adore you, and you are the source of every good. In other words, you have to be something of a snob to be an atheist.
Is God existence an a priori assumption, as some Calvinists suggest? Your arguments, then, are merely an affirmation of what is assumed.
No, I do not assume the existence of God. I try to prove the existence of God. Psychologically, we do begin by innately believing in God. Nobody is born an atheist. Atheism comes late in a person's life and in the history of the human race. So I would agree with the Calvinist in saying that the onus of proof is on the atheist. But an argument that uses God as a presupposition is not an argument. It begs the question. That's not a fair argument.
How can a conscience with absolute authority err? Pascal's wager is criticizable. God hates gamblers. Ooh, okay. How do you refute this? Okay, so there's, if you can read this.
Well, conscience can err and nevertheless have absolute authority because you must always obey your conscience, even if it's an erring conscience, because you don't know that it's an erring conscience. If I sincerely believe that I ought to join the Army, and you sincerely believe that you ought to be a draft dodger, then I would be sinning by being a draft dodger, and you would be sinning by joining the Army. Yet one of us is wrong. So to say that conscience is infallible is different than saying it's authoritative. I should not say that it's infallible, but it's authoritative. And I don't recall reading in Scripture the words, God hates gamblers. But I think God is not at all satisfied with gamblers, and he would vastly prefer better motives for believing in him than Pascal's wager. It is a very low and selfish motive, but God as a lover stoops to conquer.
How do you deal with the problem of evil, i.e., if God exists, is all-powerful and all-loving, evil exists, therefore God doesn't?
Wow. There are at least 24 good proofs for the existence of God. There is only one good proof against the existence of God. Throughout the history of philosophy, there's only one argument which even claims to prove conclusively that there couldn't possibly be a God, rather than just offer some possible alternatives. And that's the argument from evil. If there is infinite goodness, how can there be any evil? If there is a God whose goodness is infinite and whose power is infinite, how come he allows evil? I can't prove my answer to that question, but I can open the door a little bit. I can show, I think, how it is possible to believe without contradiction that evil is real and that God exists. If God's goodness is ultimately love, and if one of the things that love does is affirm the other, and if the other is a human being who is free, then God is going to so respect human freedom that he is going to let us commit evil rather than destroy us or turn us into robots out of his love. Furthermore, a perfectly good and perfectly powerful God would be writing a perfectly good story. In a perfectly good story, good triumphs over evil in the end, but sometimes there are sufferings and villains and monsters and all sorts of adventures in the story. So it is quite possible and responsible and reasonable to believe that we are in such a story and that God is deliberately allowing some evil to creep into his works. He didn't put up the sign saying no snake in the grass in the Garden of Eden, because his plan is to bring an even more great and glorious good out of evil. I can't prove that. That's the picture we get. That's the information we get. That's the divine revelation we get. And it's credible. I think I can prove that there is a God, but I can't prove that that's the right answer to evil. I must admit that evil counts against God. If there are 24 good clues that count for God and only one good clue that counts against him, I think the preponderance of evidence is on his side.
I have seen several seminars and read articles on proving the existence of God. But doesn't the idea of proving the existence of God contradict Christian faith?
No. Faith is a response to divine revelation. Divine revelation means things God has told us about himself. One of the things God has told us about himself is that he created us in his own image as thinking beings. Thus, he teaches us through two different textbooks, reason and faith, or nature and the Bible. And such a teacher cannot contradict himself. Truth cannot contradict truth. Therefore, reason cannot contradict faith. All right.
What is the answer to the child's question, if God made us, who made God?
The same as the answer to the question, is your typewriter a Republican typewriter or a Democratic typewriter? It's really a silly question. Who made X presupposes that X was made. The meaning of the word God is the being that was not made, but is the first cause, the maker. So it's a misunderstanding of the meaning of the word God.
I'm going to try to tie a couple questions together here. If belief in God is so rational, why then do people not believe? What part does faith come into our beliefs? So there's the idea of the rationality there. Have you ever spoken with objectivists? My roommate is objectivist, and they believe that reason and faith are mutually exclusive, that those who are religious give their minds to God and therefore cannot live by rationality.
I think I answered the second question already about the contradiction between reason and faith. The first one was what? How was that phrased again? If belief in God is so rational, why don't people believe in God? Usually not because of careful, sincere, honest, rational investigation of evidence. Usually because God is a big inconvenience. At least the God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is the God who contradicts a very deep instinct in us, which Christians call original sin, or which you might call original selfishness. We all want to be our own God. We all want to sing Sinatra's song, I Did It My Way. And unfortunately, that's the song they sing in hell. In heaven, they sing God's way is the best way. So there's a very strong psychological reason for not wanting to believe in God. Especially in America, God is a great bother to your sex life.
Good night. Thank you for coming. Go. Okay. What about Jesus? Was he God? If so, do we believe in Jesus in order to believe in God? Also, based on that, do you believe that someone who has not accepted Christ as his or her Savior but wagers as to the existence of God, will that person go to heaven when he or she dies? If so, why?
Okay. Let me first add one little corollary to my last statement. that ultimately God is a great plus to our sex life. That is, people who do it God's way are always in the long run happier. What about Jesus? Is he God? If he isn't, he's the biggest blasphemer or nut or insane egotist who ever lived. But nobody thinks he's that. Even his enemies don't think he's an idiot or a lying, blaspheming, scheming fool. He claimed to be God. If he was God, or rather is God, do we have to believe in Jesus in order to believe in God? Those of you who are here this afternoon heard a rather long and complex answer to that question, so let me see if I can summarize it. According to Christians, Jesus is not just a human person. He is a divine person. He is not just a 33-year-long, 6-foot-high Jewish carpenter seen by a few thousand people in Palestine long ago. He is the second person of the Trinity. He is the mind of God. He is, in New Testament terms, the Logos, or light that enlightens everyone who comes into the world. Therefore, everyone, including an atheist and a pagan and a Hindu and a Buddhist, has contact with Jesus. On that contact, he will be judged. If, for example, Socrates pursued the truth that he knew with all his heart and worshipped the God that he knew in a rather agnostic way with all his heart, if he did not sin against the light that he had, then if and when he goes to heaven, and I think that's possible but no one knows, he will find that the one who saved him was Jesus. If you were to ask Abraham or Moses or Elijah, do you accept Jesus Christ as your Savior? They would not say yes. They would say, I don't know what you're talking about. Yet they were saved. According to Christians, Jesus is the way that we know God, just as sunlight is the way we know the sun, made of the same stuff. Jesus claims to be the only Savior. He doesn't claim that you have to have accurate theological knowledge of him in order to be saved. God doesn't give you a theology exam at the gate of heaven and let you in only if you get a 70. So objectively, yes, you have to know Jesus. Subjectively and consciously, no. However, if you do know him and reject him, then, according to the Bible, you're at least in big trouble. Do you believe that someone who has not accepted Christ but wagers on the existence of God will go to heaven when they die? Well, I think the low form of the wager, based on a fear of hell, is something that God is not satisfied with, but it pleases him. It's like a toddler's first step. A parent is not going to be satisfied with that step, but it's going to lead in a certain direction. It's not going to stop there. So I regard the wager not as a final stage, but as a beginning stage. If it doesn't lead anywhere, if it's purely selfish, if the only thing I'm worried about is avoiding pain, I don't think that's sufficient for salvation. If, however, my wager is a personal relationship, like marriage, well, that's a little different. Every marriage is a wager. No lover comes proposing in syllogisms or with a battery of lawyers with written guarantees. Leap into my arms, and when you do it, you are married. So when you do it, you are saved.
Does the Calvinistic idea of total depravity contradict the idea that everyone has a conscience?
No, and it didn't for John Calvin. I think what Calvin meant by total depravity was a strictly theological meaning. That is, we're totally unable to save ourselves, and no matter how many good works we do, that can't buy our way into heaven. Well, he's perfectly correct if that's what he means. I don't think Calvin was so foolish as to mean what most people think he meant by total depravity, namely that nobody can do any good at all and that we're just as bad as we could possibly be. In fact, Calvin very strongly believed in conscience. By the way, I'm not a Calvinist.
If I would like to hear or read these or other arguments, are there any books that you would recommend that you or others have written?